Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining this session. This is FHIRing Up Primary Care with Specialty Clinical Decision Support. I'll start by introducing myself. I'm Lucienne. I'm the founder and CEO of Remedy. I started my career in technology. I worked on both mobile and communications technologies, both as a scientist and then as an investor, before switching into healthcare. I trained in OBGYN as well as a bench researcher, where I worked on gene therapy for single gene disorders. Remedy is a software company based in Atlanta, Georgia. We work with healthcare delivery systems to support their quality improvement, workflow optimization, and patient engagement initiatives. We've been a FHIR-first platform for many years now. So before I move into talking about our application, I thought I would briefly cover the industry challenges that we are addressing. First of all, we have a primary care shortage in the United States. Last year, the American Association of Medical Colleges did a study projecting that we will be short 139,000 physicians, most of them in primary care, by the year 2033. This is driven by an aging American population, the large number of doctors reaching retirement age. Then on top of that, a study this year in the Annals of Internal Medicine showed that increasing the number of providers, so more primary care providers, could save more than 7,000 lives each year and increase the life expectancy of the average American by 2 months. So why is that important? Well, because much of this gain in life expectancy is due to early screening and treatment of chronic disease. So we have a shortage of providers, but we know that more providers lead to better outcomes. And then we have this growing burden of chronic disease. 6 in 10 Americans have at least one chronic disease, and 4 in 10 have 2 or more. And these are leading drivers of cost, morbidity, and mortality in our population. So if we pick a particular chronic disease, nonalcoholic fatty liver disease, and nonalcoholic steatohepatitis, this liver disease has an estimated prevalence of 20% in the US population. Yet the largest study to look at actual prevalence in diagnosed cases in the health record showed it was only 1.85%. So that tells us that there are a large number of people that have not been screened and diagnosed, and therefore cannot be treated early. So how are we to solve for this and address this gap in care? And what's driving it? Well, part of what's driving it is something called clinical inertia. Simply put, the tendency to continue practicing medicine the way we've practiced medicine. And clinical inertia is one of the drivers of the Institute of Medicine study that showed that it takes, on average, 17 years for new evidence to become fully incorporated into the practice of medicine. So here we have a shortage of doctors, growing chronic disease, and underdiagnosis. And so we'll look at how Smart on FHIR applications focused on specific chronic diseases can help drive more efficient screening and diagnosis, and therefore help us improve this outcome even in the face of a physician shortage. So what's the opportunity with FHIR and CDS hooks? So at Remedy, we offer problem-based views across many chronic disease states, and we run those as Smart on FHIR apps. Because part of the challenge for clinicians is data. It's too much data in too many places, which is inefficient for them to access and review. What the clinicians really want is curated data and actionable insights. Problem-based views in the health record have been shown to decrease cognitive load and increase workflow efficiency. This can be achieved through a Smart on FHIR application running within the EHR on that single pane of glass and consolidating all of the information that a clinician needs for decision-making about that particular chronic disease. So that's what we're doing here in the case of fatty liver disease. CDS hooks is important because that's what's driving the so what. So we've layered on top an implementation of CDS hooks and CDS cards within our FHIR-based platform to help drive that right intervention for the right patient at the right time. So here's an example of that problem-based view for fatty liver disease. All of the data here, we are pulling via FHIR resources from the EHR, except for the risk scores shown in red and orange, which we are calculating for that patient. Those risk scores are used to drive those next best steps in care in fatty liver disease. We then implemented the CDS Hooks workflow to support multiple endpoints. Our CDS decision support engine is able to support national practice guidelines, and I'll show how those are linked in, client or site-specific protocols, remote monitoring data in addition to the EHR data. We're able to drive some of the referral management processes within the health system and support that workflow, as well as clinical trial recruitment. So I'll provide a couple of examples that we've implemented within this Smart on FHIR platform, leveraging different hooks and different calls to action to the end user. So here's an example of a CDS card that would come up based on those risk scores that I showed that we are calculating. And the way that we've architected our CDS cards to be consistent with the spec as best we can is there's always a title to the card. There's always a description of the card, which includes in almost every case a link to evidence or practice guidelines, as you see hyperlinked here in blue for the AASLD guidelines. Then we show the end user the criteria that that specific patient meets. There could be multiple criteria in the hooks that we've designed, and so every patient may have slightly different criteria, say if there are 2 or 3 or 4 that could qualify them for that card. And we also show the clinician the actual score, the actual lab value, the actual diagnosis that's driving the card. So that's what we've enumerated here in numbers 1, NAFLD fibrosis score, and number 2, diagnosis of type 2 diabetes. We then describe the call to action and the action that's going to take place upon selection of the different buttons for the clinician. So I think this is pretty in line with the specification that had identified a variety of different CDS cards, right? Information cards that just display text to an end user, suggestion cards, which are some of the ones that we show, and app link cards. So the user sees these cards embedded in the workflow and can interact with them. So the pink buttons down here drive specific actions. Here's another example looking specifically at referral management. So within a health system, they want to ensure that their specialists are getting the right patients to them early for intervention and management, but also to give the comfort to primary care and others who might be able to manage that patient with fatty liver disease who is at low risk, as demonstrated by their fibrosis score. So this is a very simple example and implementation showing how we can flag a patient who's high risk for referral, but we could also include text around disease management for those low risk patients who should stay with their primary provider. And then lastly, I'll show this example where we are identifying a patient who could benefit from education. So according to the guidelines, all patients should be offered education about their disease. And we provide some evidence here, and we link to that evidence. That 7 to 10% body weight loss has been shown to start to reverse fat deposition in the liver. If the clinician here were to choose enroll, we actually directly text message or email the patient with a link to the education course, as well as document that action in the platform. I should have said, in all of these cases, we have usually a not now or later button where clinicians can defer the card until the next time that it surfaces when they are accessing that patient record. And then we usually have a decline option. And often cases in our implementations, if the user selects that option, we're going to query them for more information about why they're declining the recommendation. This helps us, as well as the client site, improve on those recommendations and workflows to be more helpful to them, or may help the client site do further education with their clinical staff if they don't see them adhering to protocols and guidelines as they think they should. So here are the FHIR resources that we're using in this implementation. We're using the appointment resource to help providers identify patients who are on their schedule that day. Many providers will do what's called pre-charting, which allows for more efficient workflow during the day in clinic. This means they're reviewing patients who they'll be seeing that day in clinic at the beginning of the day, or maybe at the beginning of their week. And using the appointment resource, we are able to flag to them those patients who have upcoming appointments and have CDS cards pending, in order for them to go ahead and maybe address those cards, or at least review them before they have the patient in front of them. We're both reading and posting to the document reference endpoints. This allows us to pull clinical notes, as well as to push care plan summaries back into the EHR of the action that was taken within the Remedy platform, including the CDS cards. We're using the immunization endpoint, which is important in specialty areas like liver disease, where they might be looking for something like hepatitis B immunization status and overall risk reduction for liver disease. With medication statement, we're accessing their current medications per guidelines in order to maximize risk reduction. So this could be suggesting blood pressure medicines to reduce ASCVD risk, which is cardiovascular risk, or lipid-reducing medications, as there's interplay between hyperlipidemia and fatty liver disease. And so it's important that patients are on the right kind of lipid-reducing medication. The observation endpoint is obviously where we're pulling many of the vitals and labs that we're using to drive those risk scores and pathways. The patient endpoint is providing the patient identifiers and demographics that we need. Obviously, the practitioner endpoint is giving us context around that practitioner and their patient list. And then finally, the procedure endpoint. There are several procedures involved in liver disease, such as a scan called a fiber scan or a liver biopsy procedure. So we're able to access those via that endpoint. So what have we learned in developing and implementing this application? Number one, I'll start with is that, in areas like this, clinical guidelines are still emerging. They're changing, as they are in every area of medicine, usually kind of yearly update cycles, as are the sort of practices and technical capabilities around this area of medicine. That can be challenging to get a project going when everybody can get fixated on the fact that we don't have final evidence or final guidelines. And so our learning has been just to start somewhere. And instead of thinking of a minimal viable product, maybe think of a minimal acceptable implementation that you can start with and get it live, get users using the application, using the CDS, knowing that you're going to continue to iterate and build from there. Number two, many sites where we implement, we may be the first, second or third FHIR application they've ever done. We have a place where we were the first, second, third, and fourth FHIR applications that they had implemented. And, it's still early days. The resources won't all be mapped. There will be surprises along the way. And this just means that there's a learning curve, often on the client side as well as the vendor side. And you just need to be collaborative and patient and work through it together. Lastly, large health systems are, could be bureaucratic and a lot of decision by committee. And our two key takeaways are that you need that clinical champion with decision-making authority who's going to drive your project through. And you need some really great project management partners at the site to help get over all those hurdles, get through the committees, and get a product live. This is where you can find me throughout DevDays. And I'll be happy to take questions in the chat or you can reach me in one of these mechanisms, and I'll be happy to answer your questions now or later.
Thank you so much, Lucienne. Lucienne Ide, the CEO and founder of Remedy, is here. If you have any questions, you may ask now. I see that there are questions for you. Lucienne, go ahead.
Yeah, so thank you. So I'll start answering a few of these questions. The first question is, where are the CDS cards displayed to the practitioner? How do we manage implementation to implement triggers for the cards in these systems, and in which environments did you test with FHIR data? So the cards surface within the iframe of the Smart on FHIR application. We can tie the card event though to something like a BPA alert in Epic, right? So that BPA surfaces natively within Epic and would drive the user to launch the Smart on FHIR application, and the card would display there. We have tested this in Cerner and Epic and Athena and Lucienne and a couple of other sandboxes. Can I speak further to some of the technical challenge we had to overcome in actually deploying CDS hooks? How sensitive are we to particular FHIR resources? And are codable concepts stable enough in the areas we target to be relatively consistent? So, we are building towards the future when we can run these CDS cards natively within the different EHR environments. I think the advantage of, starting with sort of the hook happening within our own platform, right, and not necessarily running the cards natively within the EHR experience, is that we do have a bit more control over that data, and to some degree clean that data that then we're storing in our application that's driving the event. Most of our data that's driving our CDS hooks workflows and implementations, is US CDI data. So, we deal with some of the issues at our initial FHIR implementation where there might be site-to-site differences in those resources, but by the time we're implementing the CDS workflows, it tends to be pretty stable and work quite well. Can we speak further to some of the technical challenges we've had to overcome in actually deploying CDS hooks? How sensitive is our use of, okay, that's the same one. Sorry, the questions kind of jump around on the app as new ones come in, so it's hard for me to follow where I was. Is there a particular set of guidelines or producer of guidelines that we recommend standardizing on? I don't know if that is related to CDS hooks or to the clinical guidelines. We have built up a library of these CDS cards and pathways. So when we deploy at a new client site, we usually start with a recommendation according to their use case of what other clients have done, but often we're implementing custom rules and pathways for them as well. Like the referral example, right, was one that is very specific to different client sites, and trying to sort of match their existing processes, but drive efficiency around making sure that a patient who's referred to a specialist ends up making the appointment and getting to that specialist. And so our ability to directly communicate with a patient, say via text message based on a card event, as well as notify a coordinator for scheduling, and drive them straight to our registry view and highlight the patient who was just referred. So we have a whole workflow downstream from these cards based on card events, as we call them. To what extent are we using FHIR meta model to structure the content? For example, the clinical practice guidelines or a clinical reasoning module in the FHIR spec. We are not yet. I think that's an area of great interest, and we are certainly anticipating down the road sort of interfacing with guidelines as codable concepts, right, that would be able to directly interact with our platform. Let me see if there are any other questions in the chat. Hang on. Have we ever encountered the same medical terminology explained by different combinations of FHIR resources? Probably, right? I mean, this is still, it's still messy, and I don't think, while we have tried to, adhere to and standardize, adhere to the spec and standardize the way we do this, there are several different ways that you could sort of arrive at the same endpoint. And, one of our challenges right now is really working on what that standardization internal process is and documentation around this library of CDS cards and pathways.
I think that's all the questions that you have. You've answered all the questions.
Thank you.
And we are out of time, looks like. Somebody has commented that it was a great talk. I agree, Lucienne. Thank you so much for this excellent presentation. And thanks everyone for joining us. Please don't forget to rate the session. This is Sadhana Alangar, HL7's Director of Education, signing off. Bye, everyone.